Hello, I have today with me John Mearsheimer, professor, distinguished professor at the University of Chicago. And John Mearsheimer is a legend. He was already a distinguished professor when I studied for my PhD in Princeton, and we read papers and articles by John and books. And John is a realist. He is in the realist school, and he's a voice of clarity in today's world. And he's trenchant and brilliant analysis of global political situations, especially the Ukraine war and also the situation in Gaza and the global changing security climate are a big part of keeping the public informed. And you really have some unconventional but very well-reasoned views. And we are very happy to have you here. Thank you, John.
My pleasure, Max. Thank you very much for having me.
John, we had you in Germany at this place more than 3 years ago in June of 22. The Ukraine war was still pretty fresh, and we discussed various aspects of that war. And we won't go too much into the prehistory because that's been discussed, but what has changed in your analysis of the war in those 3.5 years? I mean, what were the surprises? What went as expected? If you look back at this whole, those terrible 4 years in which hundreds of thousands of young men and certainly also some women have died.
Well, I think the best way to start, Max, is to know that the reason that Putin went into Ukraine was that he wanted, above all else, to make sure Ukraine did not join NATO. And what happened was that a few days after the invasion, and I want to be clear here, this is just a few days after the invasion, Putin sends a signal to Ukraine that he would like to negotiate. And negotiations actually start, and this becomes the famous Istanbul negotiation that takes place in March and April of 2022. And you remember the war starts on February 24th, 2022. So you can see that almost immediately after the war starts, there are negotiations to end it, which focus on making sure that Ukraine is not in NATO. Now, what happens is almost everybody knows is that in early April, the Americans and the British tell the Ukrainians to walk away from the negotiations. Now, there's no evidence that they had reached a final deal in Istanbul, that is, the Ukrainians and the Russians, but they were moving towards some sort of agreement that would satisfy the Russians and the Ukrainians and put an end to the war shortly after it started. But again, the Americans and the British played the key role in telling Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations, which he did.
Boris Johnson flew to Kiev.
Yes, exactly. Boris Johnson flew to Kiev. He was the point man for the Anglo-Saxons. Uh, but the end result of this, Max, is that the war then escalated. And what you have gotten is a major war of attrition on the front lines that looks a lot like World War I. But not only has uh, the war escalated on the battlefield, the goals have escalated on the Russian side. The Russians are now committed to capturing and annexing a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory. The Russians, as a result of this escalation, now have a series of maximalist demands that the Ukrainians and the Europeans simply will not accept. So we're in a situation now, given that this wasn't settled at Istanbul, where you can't reach a diplomatic settlement. It's out of reach. And the war will be settled on the battlefield. And of course, the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. And Ukraine is going to end up as a dysfunctional rump state. So that's sort of how I see this war playing out over time. To put it in capsule form, I think there was a chance of shutting it down almost immediately after it started. But once that didn't take place, escalation took place, both in terms of the combat on the battlefield, number one, and two, in terms of the goals of the Russians. And it led to this situation where it will be settled on the battlefield.
Didn't we, for some time, think that this would be over sooner, that Ukraine would probably be defeated sooner, and it's been dragging on for a long time? Has that come in as a surprise?
No, I think that's a myth that the West created. I think if you look at the run-up to the war, we had no interest in preventing a war. In fact, I think the evidence shows that the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, basically was looking forward to the war. We thought that we were going to defeat the Russians. We thought we were going to bring the Russians to their knees. I mean, if we thought that Ukraine was in desperate straits, we would not have told them to walk away from the Istanbul negotiations. The reason we told Ukraine to walk away from the Istanbul negotiations is we thought we were going to win the war.
Mhm.
And let me make 2 points with regard to that. First of all, it's very important to understand that the crisis started in 2014. The war began 8 years later in 2022. And between 2014 and 2022, the United States and its European allies trained and armed the Ukrainian military. So the idea that the Ukrainian military was hopelessly outnumbered and stood no chance against the Russians is simply wrong. The Russians had a small force. They invaded Ukraine with a small force. General Syrskyi says it was only 100,000 troops. It was not a well-trained and formidable army. This was not the Wehrmacht, right? And at the same time, the Ukrainians had a military that had been trained up and armed by NATO. So the Ukrainians were in a good position to do well against the Russians. And you want to remember that the Ukrainian army won two big victories in 2022, one in Kherson and the other in Kharkiv. It wasn't like the Ukrainian army was on its back foot in 2022. This is a myth that's been created in the West, one among many. The second point, and this is of enormous importance, is that we in the West believed, this of course doesn't include me and you, that economic sanctions would bring the Russians to their knees. It was the combination of economic sanctions plus defeat on the battlefield, defeat of the Russians on the battlefield, that would knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. And this is why we, again, told Zelensky to walk away from Istanbul. And by the way, it's why in November of 2022, we're in November of 2022, the Ukrainians have now won two big victories, as I said before, one at Kharkiv and one in Kherson against the Russians. General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said publicly that now was the time to cut a deal. This is what Milley said. Let's cut a deal. Milley understood that by late 2022, the Ukrainian army had reached the high water mark. It was not going to get any better. Because Putin was mobilizing Russian forces, you remember he called up 300,000 soldiers in September of that year. Milley said, let's cut a deal now. The Biden administration told him absolutely not, and they told him to keep his mouth closed. And the question is why? And the answer is we thought that we had the Russians on the ropes and we were going to finish them off. We were going to bring Russia to its knees, knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. Now, that was a flawed assumption. And in fact, as things developed over 2023, 2024, and now 2025, the balance of power has shifted massively in Russia's favor, and Ukraine is in desperate straits.
We see, of course, the favors and the gains on the Russian side accelerating, but it's still a very tedious ground war, a slow ground war, even though it's accelerating to some extent. Do you see a possibility of it accelerating even further, like almost a snowball effect, so that we have a collapse of the Ukrainian army or some effect, something to that effect, or will it drag on for a long time? It's a difficult prediction, I know.
Well, I think in a war of attrition, basically what you have is two massive armies standing toe to toe, trying to bleed each other white. And the question is, which army will quit first? This is analogous to what happened in World War I, where the Germans between 1914 and 1917 were up against the Russians, the French, and the British. And the question was, which side would bleed the other to the point where it would quit? And it looked by late 1917 that the Germans were going to win that war. Remember, the Russians are knocked out in the fall of 2017. The French
19,
army,
1917.
oh, 1917, sorry. Uh, the French army, of course, mutinies in the spring of 1917, and the British are on the ropes by the end of 2017. But what shifts the balance is the Americans come in. Huge numbers of American troops begin to pour into Europe, and the Germans, who have been bled white by that point, understand they can no longer continue the fight. They're finished. So the Germans quit. Had the Americans not come in, I believe the Germans would have won the war. This is World War I, of course. Uh, Now, what you have in Ukraine is a somewhat similar situation, and that is that the Russians have a tremendous advantage over the Ukrainians in firepower and in manpower. And in a war of attrition, firepower and manpower matter enormously. And the Russians are clearly bleeding the Ukrainians white. What you want to look at is the casualty exchange ratio. And
Right.
the casualty exchange ratio decisively favors the Russians. And again, the Russians have more manpower to begin with and more firepower. So it's only a matter of time before the Ukrainian army collapses. Now, the Ukrainians do not have the possibility of the American military coming to the rescue, which is what the British and the French had in 1918. That's not going to happen with Ukraine. Ukraine, in terms of fighting this war, is on its own.
Maybe the Europeans come in. I mean, there's
No,
crazy
no,
ideas.
there's no way the Europeans can come in. The Europeans have second-rate, if not third-rate military forces, and they're in no position to contest the Russian military on the battlefield. I just don't see that happening.
I'm glad
You
to hear
know,
that.
yeah, I also think it's politically impossible for the Russians, I mean, for the Europeans to come in.
They drum up all this domestic, they make all this war propaganda. I mean, Merz and Macron and Starmer, they all seem to be aiming at that at some point. I mean, so I'm very relieved to hear you say there's no way. I mean, we're not just not able to do it, but the propaganda in Europe at the moment is pointing in that direction.
Propaganda is one thing. Actually, sending ground forces from Germany, France, and Britain into Ukraine is another matter. You want to remember that the British Army has one armored division, and that one division is not fit for combat at this point in time.
One
Uh,
division.
One division. Yeah. So the idea that the British army is going to come to the rescue of the Ukrainians is laughable. And the German military is not a formidable fighting force. That's why the Minister of Defense and the Chancellor are talking about rebuilding the German army. They understand full well that the German army is not a formidable fighting force. And I would note to you that the Russian army, as I described it before, was not a formidable fighting force in 2022. The Russian army today is a much larger and much better trained army that has a huge amount of battle experience. I think if you put any European army up against the Russian army, it would not be a fair fight. The Russian army would dominate that European army, just in terms of size, quality, and battlefield experience.
I mean, just Putin has just made a statement to this effect that if the Europeans want to continue, well, that's their choice. We'll certainly keep on the fight. I mean, he just said that. So I'm relieved to hear from you that you consider it not a real option that Western European armies go there. I shudder at the idea of my son having to go there. He's 21. So I'm glad to hear that, to your assessment to that effect.
Well, let me ask you, Max,
yeah.
can I just ask you a question? What do you think would happen if I'm wrong and the European armies went into Ukraine and they defeated the Russians? The Russian army started to lose the war, and the Europeans were winning. The Europeans plus the Ukrainians were winning against the Russians. What do you think the Russians would do?
Well, it's not so fair because I've seen previous videos of you, but of course the Russians would revert to other means of warfare, like their reserve, their strategic reserves. They would probably use tactical nukes, because this is an essential fight for them.
Exactly. This is what's happening in Ukraine is an existential threat to them. If they were to lose in Ukraine, they would certainly countenance and probably use nuclear weapons. So the idea that there's no threat of nuclear escalation if you send European troops or even American troops into Ukraine is a pipe dream. This is extremely dangerous. So my argument is not only do the Europeans not have the military capability to take on the Russian army in Ukraine, if they go in there, you run a serious risk that nuclear weapons might be used.
Yes, it's a really serious risk. So has this war so far in Ukraine, has it changed the way we view war? I mean, in, let's say, the era of in the unipolar era, it was all about bombing and police actions and aerial raids and shock and awe and, let's say, limited but forceful operations with special forces. So has this ground war changed the dynamics and the economics of war as we see it?
I don't think it's changed it much at all. I mean, there's no question that most of the conflicts during the unipolar moment did not involve large-scale conventional forces fighting wars involving, armored forces and large troop concentrations. But you want to remember that the 1991 Gulf War fits that description. It was a much quicker war, of course, but it involved large-scale conventional forces. And the same was true with when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. The United States sent a very large conventional army into Iraq. It was not a war of attrition. The West or the United States won a quick and decisive victory in both cases. But those two conflicts show you that even during the unipolar moment, large-scale conventional war was a real possibility. But I think what we see in the Ukraine war that is new is the presence of drones. I think there's no question that drones have changed how conventional armies can wage war against each other. It's just become very difficult, if not almost impossible, to concentrate large-scale armored forces or mechanized infantry forces against the adversary because the adversary has so many drones that it can, chew up those ground forces quite easily. So it's quite remarkable to watch the way the war is being waged between the Russians and the Ukrainians along the front lines. Both sides privilege using tiny units, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, little packets of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 soldiers to engage with the other side and in effect figure out using those packets of infantry to figure out where the other side is located and then rely on firepower, either drones, artillery, or smart bombs to attack the other side. But you don't see much evidence of large-scale armored units or mechanized infantry units engaging each other. One lesson that comes out of this war that we had forgotten and this really matters for the West, is that you need a large-scale industrial base to wage this kind of war.
Mhm.
And the Russians have done very well because they have a large-scale industrial base that can produce huge amounts of weaponry, which is, of course, what you need to wage a war of attrition. Whereas the West, on the other hand, this is especially true of the United States, but also of Europe, ran down its industrial base during the unipolar moment, and does not have the industrial capacity to produce the, artillery and weaponry that's necessary to wage a war of attrition. And I would note to you, this is somewhat afield, but the whole question of the United States taking on China in East Asia in a conventional war, I think the United States would be at a significant disadvantage because it does not have a robust industrial base that would allow it to produce the weaponry that would be needed to fight against China for a protracted period of time. And on the other hand, the Chinese, much like the Russians, have a formidable industrial base, and they would be able to produce huge amounts of weaponry. So I think one thing we had forgotten during the unipolar moment that the war in Ukraine has reminded us of is that you need a healthy industrial base to wage a war of attrition. And by the way, if you read the Trump administration's very controversial national security strategy, which just came
Very
out,
recent, yes.
yeah, it's quite clear, Max, from that document that the Americans understand that they have a real problem in that their industrial base is not well positioned to fight a war of attrition, whether it's Ukraine or it's in East Asia.
Okay, so you already made the switch to the US. So Donald Trump came in at the beginning of this year. I voted for him, I must say. And what do you make of his Russia-Ukraine strategy?
Well, he's obviously failed. He said that he would settle it even before he moved into the White House. And then once he moved into the White House on January 20th of this year and hadn't settled the conflict, he said he would quickly settle it. He's not settled it. He's not even come close. And the war goes on. So, in terms of Trump's foreign policy vis-a-vis the Ukraine war, he's clearly failed.
But does he have I mean, is there something like the outlines of a strategy now or where he wants to go? I mean, he's gone back and forth on various positions a number of times. So do we have a picture of where he wants to take us now with this conflict or where he wants to take the US?
No. I mean, your question implies that there's a magic formula that he may have for ending this conflict on terms that are relatively favorable to the West and especially to the United States and to the Ukrainians as well. And there is no magic formula. He blew it.
Mhm. Isn't there a chance that he will go over the heads of Western Europe and just make peace with Russia and start the deals again, as we saw with the lifting of some sanctions, so that Russia and the US settle into some kind of comfortable relationship while the war is still going on?
That could happen, but the key point you want to remember here is that doesn't solve the Ukraine problem. The war goes on, as you said, and the Europeans are now joined at the hip with the Ukrainians. So this will be disastrous for Ukraine and for the Europeans. I mean, the United States plus Europe plus Ukraine could not defeat Russia. If you take the Americans out of the equation, you greatly reduce the American contribution to the war in Ukraine, and it's basically Europe plus Ukraine against Russia. There's no question that Russia's going to win. So this war will go on, and the Americans may have a good relationship with the Russians in the end, but this will be disastrous for Europe and it will be disastrous for Ukraine. I'd also note that I'm not sure that Trump can do what you described. And the reason is you want to understand that inside the United States, there are a huge number of Ukraine hawks. The European view is the dominant view. I'm talking about the European view vis-a-vis Ukraine is the dominant view inside the U.S. security establishment.
Mhm.
Trump and people like Vance and Others are outliers here. They're not in the mainstream. The mainstream in the United States is fully supportive of the European position on Ukraine. And I believe this includes Marco Rubio. So
Yes.
Trump is in a very tough position here. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that Trump has not been able to make much progress up to now in terms of shutting this war down. He's had all sorts of people inside his administration and outside of his administration. These are Republicans outside of his administration who've worked hard to undermine him. I would put General Keith Kellogg in that category, who was his principal point person on
Hmm.
Ukraine, who supports the European perspective. I would put Marco Rubio in that category. And the two people who were on the other side were Steve Witkoff and the vice president, J.D. Vance. They were interested in working out a deal with the Russians. But again, they were badly outnumbered. And that's one of the reasons that Trump has been unable to shut this one down. He faces a lot of opposition, not just from Europe and not just from Ukraine, but from inside the United States.
Okay, so now the US withdraws partially, but there's resistance, there's strong faction that wants to continue supporting Ukraine, and Putin is winning. And you already said he's escalated his demands because now those four oblasts are officially Russian territory. But where is he going to stop? There is a fear, which we both know is ridiculous, that he's going to move to Western Europe or to the Baltics. But what do you think could be the maximum demands or the maximum point at where Putin would stop this war if he was winning and there was nobody opposing him?
Well, there will be somebody opposing him. I mean, even if the Ukrainian army collapses up on the front lines, it will retreat and there will be further resistance. So this is not like the Wehrmacht going to the beaches at Dunkirk and decisively defeating France and driving the British off the continent. You're not going to have a situation like that. And Putin has made it clear that he has no interest in conquering all of Ukraine. He would
Mhm.
be a fool to try to conquer all of Ukraine because the western part of Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who would resist mightily an occupation of all of Ukraine, and any attempt to incorporate Ukraine into a greater Russia would prove to be disastrous for the Russians. And Putin surely understands this. And again, he's never said that he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine. And as you point out, the claim that he's interested in conquering the Baltics or Poland or Romania is a ridiculous argument, even though it's made frequently in the West. So I think the interesting question is how much more territory does he take than the roughly 20% of territory that he has now annexed or Russia has now annexed. And this would include the four oblasts in the easternmost part of Ukraine plus Crimea. How much more does he take beyond that? In other words, does he take Odessa? Does he take Kharkiv? Does he take places like that? My view is that a lot depends on the balance of military power. If the Ukrainian military collapses to the point where it's easy for him to move forward, or it's easy for the Russian army to move forward into Odessa, into Kharkiv, I believe he will do it. I believe he will try to capture, if it's militarily possible, about 40% of Ukrainian territory.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, why do I think that? The reason I think that is that he surely understands that the best he can hope for is a frozen conflict. He's not going to get a genuine peace agreement where Ukraine accepts the fact that Russia has annexed those four oblasts plus Crimea and they live happily ever after. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen here is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are going to go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in the areas of Ukraine that it controls, that it has annexed. The Russians are going to face never-ending problems with Europe and with Ukraine vis-a-vis those territories that they have annexed. Given that situation, if you're a Russian policymaker, you have a vested interest in taking as much Ukrainian territory as you can and weakening Ukraine as much as you can. You have a deep-seated interest in turning Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state. And by the way, if you take Odessa, right, um, you basically cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea, and that will have devastating economic consequences. And this will be in Russia's interest to do, because again, the conflict here, the shooting may stop, but the actual conflict is not going to cease. And from a European point of view, and when you talk here about Russia-Europe relations, those relations are going to be poisonous. The Europeans are going to go to great lengths to undermine Russia for the foreseeable future. They're going to go to great lengths to cause Russia real trouble inside of those areas of Ukraine that it annexed. And the Russians, for their part, are going to go to great lengths. They're already doing this, causing trouble in Europe, sowing dissension in Europe, causing trouble among European states, causing trouble inside European states, particular European states, and furthermore, undermining transatlantic relations. The Russians will have a deep-seated interest in making sure that relations inside Europe and Europe's relations with the United States are terrible for strategic reasons. It's in Russia's interest to do that. And of course, the Europeans and probably the Americans will end up trying to cause the Russians problems. And the Ukrainians will certainly try to cause the Russians problem. So to position yourself for that kind of world, if you're Moscow, you have a deep-seated interest in taking as much territory as you can. And I think that's about 40% of Ukrainian territory. And you have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state, so that it can't join NATO or the EU, and furthermore, so it can't present a serious offensive threat to Russia. So the situation that we're now in is, in my opinion, catastrophic.
I was just going to say, it's not a very happy scenario you're painting.
Well, I would ask you, what's the happy ending here? You know, what am I missing? How does this one work out? Is there a deal to be cut between the Russians on one side and the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Americans on the other side? Did Trump just miss the obvious deal? I think the answer is no. There is no deal to be cut at this point in time. Once you did not settle this war at Istanbul and it escalated into a war of attrition, you were going to end up with a catastrophic situation, which is what has happened.
Let's let's discuss a hypothetical situation. Let's discuss, I mean, this is far off, but the German government comes to power that looks for better relations with, or tries to improve relations with Russia. I mean, the major opposition party is at least there's hints, there's an internal debate going on there also, but let's say Germany pivots and wants better relations again, like the Schröder times. Will that lead to a disintegration, a collapse of the European Union, or how's the state of the European Union? Because frankly, quite a few Europeans would not be so unhappy if the EU disintegrated and made room for something new. So could the Ukraine war, I mean, right now, the European leaders are kind of using it as a catalyst to drum up support for the war, to drum up, to impose almost like a war economy, or they haven't succeeded yet. But could that war also be a catalyst for a disintegration in Western Europe, which is not entirely negative?
I think it's hard to predict where this is all headed. But I think the scenario you describe is a plausible scenario. Let me make a couple points. First of all, if the Russians win this war, as I expect will be the case, it will be a devastating defeat for NATO. And we already see from the Trump administration's national security strategy that its attitude towards Europe is contemptuous. And since U.S. involvement in Europe is encapsulated in NATO, a devastating defeat for NATO at the same time the Trump administration wants to wash its hands of Europe, probably means that U.S. influence in Europe is going to diminish significantly in the future. And NATO is likely to be a shell of its former self. Now, this means that the Americans will not be there to solve the collective action problems in Europe. This means that the Germans will be on their own in ways that they have not been in the past. And it means that all of the European countries will have to provide for their own security in ways that they haven't in the past, because again, the United States will not be there. So it's just very important to understand that any weakening of NATO, right, means a great reduction in the American commitment to providing security for Europe, which means that those European countries have to provide for their own security. And once that happens, the centrifugal forces that are there beneath the surface that have been kept at bay by the American presence will come racing to the fore. And that means that if Germany does something, it's likely that that will not leave some other European countries happy. The Hungarians may be happy, and the Slovaks may be happy if Germany tries to improve its relations with Russia, but the Poles will not be, the Baltic states will not be, and maybe France and Britain will not be. So you see that the potential for trouble inside of Europe, the potential for these centrifugal forces that have long been sitting below the surface to manifest themselves is actually very great. Now, just to say a few words about NATO and the EU, the EU has flourished over the decades. It's a truly impressive institution, as is NATO. But it's very important to understand that one of the principal reasons that the European Union has flourished is because it has operated in a secure, strategic environment. That's because NATO has provided stability in Europe. NATO has been the foundation for EU growth. And if you take NATO away, that's going to cause all sorts of problems for the EU. Because NATO is the bedrock on which the EU is built. So I would argue that given what's happening in Ukraine and given the Trump administration's attitude towards Europe, I think that NATO is going to be greatly weakened over time. The American military footprint in Europe is going to shrink, and this is going to have negative consequences for the European Union. And of course, this gets to my more general point that what you will see happen is that countries in Europe will be more on their own than they have been in a very, very long time. For a country like Germany, this goes back to about 1949 when NATO was created. If you look at Germany's relationship with Europe over time, it has been remarkably stable since 1949. And that's because Germany was embedded in NATO over almost all of that period. Of course, it didn't join NATO. I think it was until 1955, but it was it was de facto a member of NATO from 1949 forward. And furthermore, it was in the European coal and steel community to begin with, then in the European community, now in the European Union. It's been, one of the most important members of those institutions. But one could argue that that world is going away. And I would argue that if there's any serious erosion in NATO or of NATO, that world will go away, and Germany will be on its own in ways that it has not been since 1945.
So we're back to the future, as one of your articles from a long time ago predicted.
Well, Max, in that article, what I argued was that if the Russians, it was then the Soviets, if the Soviets pulled out of Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact disappeared, and the Americans pulled out of Western Europe and NATO disappeared, we would go back to the future.
And that's
Now,
where we will be.
yes, but what happened back then is that the Russians or the Soviets certainly left Eastern Europe. We all know that. And the Warsaw Pact collapsed in the early 1990s, no doubt. But the United States did not leave Europe. We stayed in Europe. So my basic argument was never tested. We didn't go back to the future in the early 1990s because, again, the Americans stayed in Europe. And why did the Americans stay in Europe? Because the Europeans wanted them to stay. The Germans wanted them to stay because the Germans wanted the Americans to provide security for them and to provide security for Western Europe. Most people don't understand this, but the Soviets were perfectly content to allow the United States to remain in Europe and for NATO to remain intact. They did not want NATO expansion, as you well know, but they wanted NATO to exist because they understood, the Soviets understood, and of course the Germans understood, the other European countries understood, and the Americans understood that we were the pacifier, especially with regard to Germany. We provided, through NATO, a security umbrella that the Germans deeply appreciated and wanted to keep intact. What we're talking about now is we're talking about a situation where, again, as a result of this disastrous war in Ukraine, as a result of the Trump administration's contempt towards Europe and Europeans, and also, and this is very important, and I did not mention this before, also because of the imperative for the United States to pivot to Asia to deal with the China threat, there is a serious chance that NATO, as we have known it for most of our lives, will disappear. And the end result is, again, that Germany, and not only Germany, but other European countries will be on their own. You want to think about Poland in this regard. Poland is much more of a frontline state than Germany is when it comes to dealing with Russia. And the Poles will be tempted to think about buttressing their conventional forces even more than they have, and they'll be tempted to think about acquiring nuclear weapons, not because they're evil, but because they will be very fearful of Russia in the absence of an American security umbrella. Now, maybe that won't happen. And if it doesn't happen, if NATO remains intact, then, we will see a continuation of the order that has basically existed since 1949. But I would not bet a lot of money on that.
Is there any hope that this war will end next year?
I find it hard to imagine that Ukraine can continue throughout all of 2026. I find it hard to imagine that they can even make it to the spring of 2026. I'm actually, to be honest, Max, quite surprised that the Ukrainian military has not collapsed already. I think that the casualties that they have suffered have been so enormous, and the damage to their frontline fighting forces has been so extensive, and their prospects of turning around the situation on the battlefield are so hopeless that I just find it hard to understand how they have been able to continue to fight so tenaciously against the Russians.
It's
It's
amazing, isn't
actually
it?
truly impressive.
It's impressive. Yes,
Truly
but
impressive. The Ukrainians have really hung in there. I think that it shows you the power of Ukrainian nationalism. Um, but the point is that it's a hopeless situation. This again, to go back to the German case, if you look at how the Germans fought between 1914 and 18, the tenacity of the Germans was just truly impressive. Their ability to take on the Russians, the French, and the British for 4 years, and then to take on the Americans for a good part of 1918 and hang in the fight and actually do very well is truly remarkable. But even the Germans at some point just could not fight any longer.
mhm.
They eventually threw in the towel. They gave up, uh, despite the tremendous effort they made in the first, 4.5 years of the war. But I think at some point, looking at Ukraine, they will undoubtedly the Ukrainian army will undoubtedly fall apart. When exactly that will happen is hard to say. I didn't think they'd make it to the end of 2025, to be honest. So I'm somewhat surprised that they're still hanging in there. But I believe that they're hanging in there by a thread, as we say in the United States. And I think that they can't go on for very long. Uh,
Well, yeah. Yeah, let's pray that the killing will stop sometime soon. There's a good likelihood, a good chance, as I listen to you, that this will end not too far in the future. I have one other area I want to touch upon briefly. I listened to some of your analysis, and you pointed out that the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities and that short war and exchange of rockets and bombs between Israel and Iran and the United States was a huge strategic defeat for Israel. And that's not what the media is telling people here in Germany. So, if the media is telling much at all. So, why do you come to the conclusion that that situation was a defeat for Israel? I mean, we did bomb, but the US did bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities. And so, on the surface, this all looks pretty straightforward.
Well, there are a couple of points. One is you have to, first of all, look at what Israel's goals were, and then ask yourself whether or not they achieved those goals. Uh, and they had two broad goals. The first goal was to eliminate once and forever uh, Iran's ability to enrich uranium. It's very important to understand that Iran has a nuclear enrichment capability. It can enrich uranium up to the level where it can produce a nuclear weapon. And the Israelis are determined not simply to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. They could live with an Iranian nuclear program as long as Iran does not have the capability to enrich uranium or to reprocess plutonium. So the Israelis and the Americans tried to eliminate forever Iran's ability to
Mhm.
enrich uranium. Uh, they failed. Iran still has the ability to enrich uranium,
How,
and we
how
no
do we know
longer,
that? Mhm. How do
pardon?
we know that? How do we know that? Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, that's a huge claim.
No, they have the knowledge. They've already done it. They can
Okay.
easily reconstruct any of the facilities that we damaged. Look, Max, the United States in 1949, after the Soviet Union exploded its first bomb, thought long and hard about launching a preventive war against the Soviets' nuclear capability to prevent them from ever acquiring a bomb. In the early 1960s, both the Soviets and the Americans thought about doing the same thing to China. We thought about launching a preventive war against China to prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons. The temptation was there. In both cases, we did not do it because we knew that they had the ability and the know-how to make a bomb. And even if we eliminated any of that capability in the short term, they would just rebuild that capability in places where we could not see it being done, and they would end up with a bomb. The argument was, just to go back to the Soviet case in the late 40s, early 50s, we may knock out their capability temporarily, but we could not prevent them from getting a bomb. And there is no way that the Israelis can permanently prevent Iran from acquiring or maintaining a nuclear enrichment capability. It just can't be done. So they may, with the Americans, have destroyed a good chunk of Iran's nuclear enrichment capability in those June attacks. We don't know for sure because we don't know exactly what happened. But let's assume that they did destroy a huge portion of the nuclear enrichment capability that Iran has. It can easily rebuild it. So the idea that this is a permanent solution, no way. It's not even, in my opinion, a temporary solution. That's one goal. The second goal was to do in Iran what the Americans, the Turks, and the Israelis have done in Syria, which is to break it apart, to fracture it into different parts that meant that Iran would not be a unified whole. So the Israelis were not simply interested in dealing with the nuclear enrichment problem. They were also interested in breaking Iran apart. And they talk about this all the time. They wanted to do to Iran what has been done to Syria. They failed on that count as well. So the idea that the Israelis solved their problems with Iran, no, sir. And furthermore, you know that the Israelis are now talking about attacking Iran again. There's this whole discourse on the internet among responsible people about whether Israel should attack Iran again. Well, I would ask you, if Israel and the United States were so successful, why are they talking about attacking Iran again? They're talking about attacking Iran again because, number one, they did not eliminate the nuclear enrichment capability on a permanent basis. And number two, they did not do to Iran what they did to Syria. Another very important point is that Iran hit Israel very hard in that exchange in June.
There's not much we hear in Germany about this, and that Israel got hit pretty hard.
Well, that's because you don't have a free press in Germany, right?
Yes,
in
that's
Germany,
true.
when it comes to talking about all sorts of issues, but especially Israel, you're just not allowed to say all sorts of things about Israel, right? So you parrot the Israel line in Germany, which is to say that Israel hardly suffered at all, and it won a great victory against Iran. But the fact is, Israel suffered enormous damage. And furthermore, by the time the war ended, remember, it was a 12-day war, only a 12-day war. By the time the war ended, Israel was running out of defensive missiles that could be used against the incoming Iranian ballistic and cruise missiles. Just very important to understand that. And furthermore, all the evidence is that the Iranians got increasingly sophisticated at using their ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones to penetrate the Israeli defenses. And all the evidence is that the Israelis were very interested in ending the war after 12 days. The Israelis did not want to continue the war because they understood that the Iranians had a huge inventory of ballistic missiles and would continue to do damage to Israel. You want to understand that there were a lot of people who thought the Iranians were foolish to agree to end the war after 12 days. Their view is that the Iranians were beginning to get the upper hand over the Israelis. The Iranians were doing more significant damage in Israel than the Israelis were doing in Iran. So, according to that logic, Iran should have continued the war. So I would say to those people who think that Israel won a great victory, Israel's in the driver's seat, and Israel can do this again, and it'll be another great victory. You want to remember that the Iranians have lots of ballistic missiles. They learned a lot from the 12-day war, and they will pound Israel again. And furthermore, and this is not to be underestimated, one of the reasons the Trump administration was so anxious to shut the war down after 12 days was that the Iranians were talking about shutting down the Persian Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
And that sent shivers through the United States, right? The thought of the Persian Gulf being shut down. So if we go to war, we meaning the United States and Israel against Iran again, not only is damage likely to be done to Israel, serious damage that is, but also there's a great danger that the straits will be closed and that the Persian Gulf will be shut down, and that will have a devastating effect on the international economy.
Okay, then these are perspectives we don't hear much in Germany. That's why I'm so grateful to you, John, that we can have this conversation. So, do you see any resolution for all the mess that has been created in the Middle East at this point? Or where can it go?
No, not at all. If you look at the Israelis, although there's a ceasefire in Lebanon, they're continually bombing Lebanon, and they refuse to evacuate from southern Lebanon. And all the evidence is that they plan to stay in southern Lebanon for the foreseeable future. If you look at the situation in Syria, they continue to bomb Syria pretty much at will. And there have been reports that there have been Israeli tanks on the outskirts of Damascus. And there's all sorts of evidence that they plan to stay in southern Syria as well as southern Lebanon for the foreseeable future. If you look at the situation in Gaza, I think one could argue we have a temporary pause in the genocide, but it's quite clear that the Israelis are bent on ethnically cleansing Gaza. And if they can't ethnically cleanse Gaza, murdering the Palestinians in Gaza. If you look at what they're doing on the West Bank, it's clear that they're interested in ethnically cleansing the West Bank as well. They're doing absolutely horrible things to the Palestinians who live on the West Bank. And there's no hope of any sort of meaningful settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. President Trump likes to argue that he shut down the conflict between Gaza, the conflict in Gaza between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that he's brought peace to the Middle East. This is not a serious argument. He hasn't shut down the conflict at all. There's no hope of shutting down this conflict. The only hope would be if the Palestinians were going to get a state of their own or get some sort of self-determination. But that's not going to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu has just said, once again, actually in the presence of the German chancellor, that there will be no Palestinian state. And of course, his goal is not to accommodate the Palestinians in any way, but in fact to drive them out of Gaza and to drive them out of the West Bank. So we have all of those problems, and then we go back to Iran. As I told you, the Iranians have not been defeated. Iran remains intact. It has a nuclear enrichment capability, and the Israelis are talking about attacking Iran again. So when you add up the situation with the Palestinians, the situation in Lebanon, the situation in Syria, and the situation with regard to Iran, it's hard to see how there's going to be peace or stability in the Middle East anytime in the near future.
Is there any hope? I mean, there's, of course, also quite some domestic protests and upheaval in Israel. Is there any hope that in the foreseeable future we'll have a reasonable government there or a moderate government? And could that improve things?
No. The political center of gravity in Israel has moved steadily to the right over time. And the idea that Benjamin Netanyahu is an anomaly and that there is this moderate left or moderate center that can produce a government that will set things right in the Middle East is not true. Netanyahu represents the mainstream in Israel. That's why he keeps getting elected. That's why he hasn't been thrown out of office. And furthermore, if you look at the political constellation of forces in Israel, there are a huge number of people to his right, to Netanyahu's right. And if you look at the direction that Israel is headed, it's a continual movement rightward. The idea that there's going to be some backlash and Israel is going to become more moderate in terms of how it thinks about its foreign policy, especially its policy towards the Palestinians, is not realistic. It's just not going to happen. Israel is an extremely hawkish and racist country at this point in time, and it only becomes more hawkish and more racist over time. And it's able to do that in large part because countries like the United States, Britain, and Germany support it no matter what it does. So Benjamin Netanyahu and anybody who succeeds him understands that they can continue these horrific policies and that the United States, Britain, and Germany will support them no matter what.
Well, Professor Mearsheimer, John, this has been most enlightening. It's been perspectives we don't hear too much in Germany. Of course, you have your fan base here too, but we'll try to get this subtitled with German subtitles so we get a larger audience. It's an interesting world, and those are interesting, but not very, let's say, merry perspectives you point out. So that's why we need you, why we need your voice to be there. I thank you so much for your insights, and I hope we'll see you again.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Max. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you.